Hey, good to see everyone today. I want to welcome all the guests again today. Thanks for joining with us. I want to welcome everyone watching online as well. I know many people will choose to watch us online before they ever check us out in person. So I look forward to meeting you sometime here in the near future. If you have your Bible, go with me to Esther chapter 5. Esther chapter 5 is where we're going to be today. I have had a bit of a sinus issue all week long since last Sunday. Lost my voice and battled through it. I don't have COVID, so I already cleared that hurdle, so everyone could chill, okay? But you may have to bear with me this morning. We're going to do the best we can. I might cough a little bit. It might be awkward, but it's okay because this is the Word of God, and we're going to get through it. And so that's what we're going to do. So give me some grace today as we dive in together. In my life, there have been a couple times where I thought I was going to die. I don't know if you guys ever had one of those moments where you thought maybe you were going to die. Two of those moments. First moment was it was 2006. I was in the Philippines on a trip with the Bob Tebow Evangelistic Association. And Bob Tebow is the father of Tim Tebow, who was, Tim Tebow is the man, okay? He's the man. There's like Tom Brady and there's Tim Tebow. And so I was there. Tim didn't go on this trip. I was there with Bob and Tim's brother, Peter. And they're leading a team of like college students. About 2.5 weeks in, we're on an island where the Mayan volcano, and it starts to erupt. And it starts spewing red things. It's in the evening, and the city's like freaking out. And the threat level has gone to a level 3, and they're like, hey, it could go up to a level 4. If level 4 happens, then we got to clear the city. And so I'm on the top of the roof of our hotel with Bob Tebow, and Bob Tebow is a very militaristic man. He's just kind of like hey, we're going to take the hill, and you're going with me kind of guy. And I've told this story before, but if you're new, it's a great story. It really is. And so I'm up there with them, and he's staring at the volcano. And my friend Mike and I, who are leading this trip, are up there. We're like, hey, Bob, should we call parents? Should we start making flight arrangements to get home and get out of here, tomorrow morning? And he says, hey guys, listen, tomorrow morning, if that threat level goes up to a 4, you know what's going to happen? This whole city is going to be in disarray. They're going to be trying to get out of here. Every street's going to be full, and all the planes are going to be grounded. So what we're going to do tomorrow morning is not try to get out of here. We're going to go to the base of that volcano, and we're going to preach the gospel to all those villages and all those schools. Oh, cool. Okay, great. That's exactly what I thought you were going to say as a 26-year-old man who just found out he was going to be his first father. And I'm sitting there, okay, I'm gonna die. This is the way that the Lord has chosen for me to die. The second time I almost died was the first time I answered Marcy truthfully when she asked how she looked in those pants. And so that one, hey honey, I'm just kidding. They never answered that way again. All right. Death is a serious thing though. I mean, people lose people to death. Many people have lost people to death this year, friends and family members. Death is a serious thing, but there's something different when you lose someone to death who is a Christian, isn't there? There's something sweet about holding a hand of a loved one who's near death, maybe singing a hymn, or conversing with them as if it's the last time you're going to see them, but not really. It's just the last time you'll see them on earth. There's a sweetness to knowing that because of Jesus, death is but a shadow of an eternity to come. That Jesus gives us hope of everlasting life, forgiveness for all of our sin, and a relationship with Him forever. For the Christian, death is just a shadow because of salvation. Because of Christ, we have a different outlook on death. We have a different outlook on life. We respond differently than others do amidst, situations that might seem dire or might seem irreversible. We respond differently in difficult seasons and uncertain circumstances. When these things arise, what do we do as God's people? Well, we trust God. We go forward trusting God because of whose we are, because of whose kingdom we belong to, because He's done the work in reaching us, saving us, and sending us. We trust in his good plan. See, knowing Christ changes the perspective for how we live. It helps us to live by faith a little easier because we know that ultimately God is in control. Remember where we are in this story of Esther. Esther had two names. She lived in two kingdoms. She was Persian, but she was also a Jew. And she was stuck. She had been living in rebellion, but she's come to this moment of which Mordecai encourages her, hey, who knows? Maybe you've come to this moment for just a time as this, for such a time as this. And so Esther happens to be in the right place at the right time, and she is faced with a moment of identity. The Jews are destined to be murdered by Haman, the wicked man in the story. Esther is the queen put there by God to speak, and Esther comes to this moment of identity, having to choose between staying as a Persian or identifying with God's people. What does she choose to do? Well, we saw in chapter 4, verse 16, she says, listen, here's what we're going to do. Go call all the Jews, tell them all to fast for 3 days, and I know it's going to risk my life, but I'm choosing God. I'm choosing to step in providence, and I'm choosing that God is working, and I'm choosing to go before the king and risk my life, and if I perish, then I perish. See, she comes to this moment where she has to go, in order to follow God, I have to die to myself. I have to die to my preferences. I've got to die to what I want. I got to die to safety and die to comfort, and I got to risk my life because God has put me in this moment, in this time. So here, she has this defining moment that pushes her into trusting God by faith. Many people say this is Esther's salvation moment. Let me give you the main point of today's text. The main point is this: those who trust God walk by faith in his providence. Those who trust God walk by faith in his providence. When you talk about walking by faith, what I mean by is when we trust God by faith, we are trusting that God is at work in ways that we cannot see. When we step out in faith, we're declaring that God is in control and he is already working. Walking by faith means stepping on providence. Sometimes it can look like that we're stepping into the unknown, but quite honestly, as those who understand a providential God who's sovereign over our life, when we step in faith, we're stepping on solid providence. And so many of us live in a fear that we're not stepping the right way, and we can't trust where we're going. But walking by faith means stepping on providence. Look with me in Esther chapter 5 and see where this story goes. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, so she's already decided, she's called the fast, she's going in. If I perish, I perish. Mordecai does everything. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. The author wants you to know this is a serious moment. Because, look, 5 times it has royal, king, royal, throne. You got all these moments here that this is a serious, she is stepping in the presence of royalty before his throne. She steps in to ask her request, to wait her fate. And when the king saw Queen Esther, the first time she's called the queen is right here. Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, my wish, and to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them tomorrow, and I will do as the king has said. This is the first scene that we're given in chapter 5, and there's so much in this story that we must see, but we must see that Esther takes the first step of faith, and God is honored in any step of faith we take, and God honors Esther's faith. But there's so much about her decision that's important. I want to talk to us a little bit today about ways in which we are to step in faith. The first way is this: we step in wisdom, not foolishness. When we step out in faith, we step in wisdom, not foolishness. Esther spends 3 days in her room spiritually and strategically figuring out her plan. She prays and fasts for 3 days, and she strategizes. She goes into the court wearing her royal robe. Before this, she had to have the eunuchs help fix her up and everything. They spent years getting her ready. Not this time. She lets God be the one who prepares her spiritually. She meets with him. She puts on her robe, and she steps cautiously into the inner court, already knowing what she's going to say, already knowing how she's going to maneuver the situation, because she's incredibly clever. What she does is she steps out and waits on the king to address her, and he says, "Oh, she is so beautiful. Whatever you want. Well, then if you mean that, come to a feast." "Oh, sure, get Haman fast. Let's go to this feast." They build a feast, and there he says, "Whatever you want, Esther, I'll give it to you. Tell me what it is. If you really mean this, then come tomorrow to another feast I make." So twice now she's guaranteed before Haman to get what she wants, and if he shows the next day, this means she gets exactly what she has asked for. She is clever to be wise in the steps that she is taking, not foolish. What's important for us to know in this is that God works through our faith to bring about his purposes. Church, God works through your faith and my faith to bring about his purposes. This is why it's so important for us to operate our lives from a place of wisdom, not foolishness, not ignorance, not stupidity, not being morons or idiots. We must operate from a place of wisdom. In the Proverbs, wisdom is personified and foolishness is personified as people. And those people through the Proverbs are the way of Jesus and the way of Satan, the way of the wise and the way of the fool, the way of the world and the way of God's kingdom. Wisdom and foolishness are important for us to know. Esther here is wise, and she makes her plans. Now, all across this room, I know there are decisions every day that we're trying to make. What's wise? What's foolish? What's the wise thing for us to do? How do we step out in faith? Maybe it's a decision that some of you have in a job. Convictionally, you disagree with their practices. Convictionally, you disagree with your boss because he's incredibly immoral. He's lost integrity. And convictionally, you feel like you need to lose your job. You need to leave your job. But you're so dependent on the money. Well, what do? Well, follow your convictions and step out in faith and trust the Lord. Maybe you're a college student or a young couple who you know you're called to ministry or you're called to mission, and mom and dad have all these expectations because they've funded your college degree and you're going to be a doctor, and now you're just doing what? You're going what? And you got to say, you know what? If the Lord's called me, I'm going to step out in faith and trust the Lord to work this out or not. There's all sorts of situations and circumstances. Maybe you're in an adoption. You're thinking about adoption, and you're like, man, I hear horror stories over here, or I don't know what kind of kid we could get. What if they're dysfunctional, or what if they're whatever? Well, if God's called you to it, you got to step out in faith, believing that God's providence is right and good. See, trusting God in wisdom means making plans, being obedient to our convictions and our calling, and then stepping in faith. We shouldn't buy the kind of garbage that says you're not smart enough to make those decisions, you're not wise enough. Esther starts this story off as a young adopted woman, but God works through her story and works through her stepping out in faith, wisely, not foolishly. See, God delights in using our faith when we step out in trust. The second thing we see is that we must step in humility, not pride. We step in humility, not pride. Look with me at verse 9. And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. That means he was drunk, okay? He's a little wasted. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before Haman. He was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Mordecai here, he already knows he's destined for death, and it's Haman's fault. He doesn't care if he stands or bows for the guy. And it just fires Haman up. So much so, it says, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches. Now notice, earlier we saw Esther's identity. She has her salvation moment. I'm identifying with God. He is my king. It's him I'm living for. It's him I'm stepping in. It's him I'm glorifying. Then you find Haman, who's a complete just guy who's full of himself. He is wrapped up in idolatry. Look, he recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Not only that, he says, let me tell you what happened to me today. Even Queen Esther let no one but me come to the king, to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see that Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. He won't bow, he won't honor me, he won't give me praise. How dare him treat me that way? Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, hey, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So here behind the scenes, as Esther is stepping in faith, Mordecai is plotting and planning to kill, Haman is plotting and planning to kill Mordecai, to destroy him, to wipe him off the face of the planet, to deal with him. He builds this 75-foot gallows, which is like a big long stake, to put Mordecai on, and it's outrageous of how high it is, but he does it. And here at the end, we see early in the story, there's a decree that goes out that says, let the women live in submission unto the men. Haman wrote the thing. Now Haman is living in submission to his wife. It's just funny how the story reverses in so many ways. But what we need to see is the type of people we need to be is we need to be the type of people who model a humble submission to the Lord as we walk in this life. Not the kind of prideful, arrogant, petty, bratty people who just live in the idolatry of ourselves. We worship ourselves. We want things our way. We want God to give them to us when we want them, and when we don't get them, we're just like, what happened to you, God? Where were you at? You let me down there, God. And this sort of attitude of pride and arrogance that speaks to God like he is lower than us. Those who operate their lives as if God is dependent on you. We need to be careful of that kind of attitude. We shouldn't be those who are demanding of God. We are to daily submit to God for him to use us humbly. The gift of being used by God, the gift of being called to be used by God, is an act that we do not deserve. The salvation we do not deserve. We don't deserve to be in the presence of God at all because of our sinfulness, but because of his grace and mercy, because of his holiness and his love for us in Jesus, we are welcomed in his presence. And it is because he's brought us near that he wants to use us to accomplish his mission. Therefore, we must come to him with hearts of humility, not hearts of idolatry and pride. But third, we must step in expectation, not reservation. When we step out in faith, we must step in expectation, expecting God to already be working, expecting God to already be there. Look what he does here in this story. As Esther is stepping in faith, as Mordecai is plotting and planning, you don't hear of God, you don't see God, the thing doesn't talk of God, but now you see the hand of God behind the scenes. This is the middle of the book. This is the pivotal point in the whole story. On that night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. If you remember back in chapter 2, Mordecai saves the king's life, and it's recorded in this book And chapter 3 opens with Haman being honored, not Mordecai. And here we are, a couple chapters later, several years later, and the king can't sleep. On the night that Haman is building gallows to kill Mordecai, the king calls for the book. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." This is the pivotal point. God uses a sleepless night of the king to bring about his plans for Mordecai's salvation and protection. While Esther is stepping in faith, God is working. While Esther is stepping in faith, God is moving. And we are to step in faith, expecting God to already be working on the other side of our faith. God is moving when we're stepping. And so many times we want God to move before we step, but that's not how this goes. God is working as we are stepping. God is in the shadows, moving all things together to answer us, to set it up while we are stepping. The story continues, and the king said, "Who is in the court?" He wants to honor the man, and he says, "Who is in the court?" And just so happens Haman is at the right place at the right time. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king says, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king like to delight to honor more than me?" And Haman starts to think, oh, more praise is coming my way. Haman's like, all right, I'm going to get more praise. There's nobody greater in your kingdom, king, than me. The whole kingdom should be mine. I mean, if you were passed away, why not give it to me? Let me be like you. And so the question comes, what should be done? Here, Haman thinks he's talking about him. He goes, hey, here's what should be done, king, for the man king. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden on, whose head a royal crown has set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Could you imagine Haman's jaw? Like, what are you talking about? What? Who sits at the king's gate, leave out nothing that you have. Haman sets up the reward that Mordecai will get. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. We're talking about stepping into expectation. Stepping into God, expecting him to work, not with reservation. This story is a complete reversal of what happened. Haman wanted to be king. Do you see that? He wanted to wear the robes. He wanted to be treated like the best. He wanted the accolades. He was setting himself to put all these things up for himself. He wanted to be worshiped. He wanted to be praised for what he had done. But we remember what Psalm 49:12 says. Man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. Or what Jesus said in Matthew 23:12. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Esther went forth expecting God to come through, and the way in which God comes through is not through some guy riding on a horse, but through a king's sleepless night. You know, sometimes God uses seemingly insignificant moments in our life to move us in the right direction, doesn't he? Moments that we thought were nothing turned out to be something. Moments that just came and went, but were providential moments in God's life. I think about in the New Testament, you see some men go fishing, day of fishing on the lake. only for them to meet Jesus. You see Zacchaeus try to climb a tree, just climbing a tree, and here comes Jesus. You see a woman going to a well to get some water, and there she meets Jesus. You see Paul walking down a road to persecute more Christians, and there he meets Jesus. These seemingly insignificant moments are God's providential work in the lives of those who were destined to be saved. And all of us have providential moments that we face every day. Some of those moments were pivotal in your life. Maybe you were wandering from the Lord and you visited your hometown and you passed by the church that you were once saved at, and Lord used that moment to remind you of some things. Or someone you saw from high school or knew from high school that maybe lost their life that really affected you. Little moments that took place along the way that showed you God was with you, God was working, that God was after you. Insignificant moments matter. Even today, some of you aren't here by accident. As a matter of fact, none of you are here by accident. This sermon wasn't meant as an accident. The truths of this sermon mean something to you. And God in His providence has put you here to hear it and to call you forth in faith, to step in providence. He's calling us to step in providence. Even when we leave here today, you need to be looking for God's providence in everywhere you go. I mean, I sat at a car dealership on Friday morning for 4 hours, and I got to talk to a man about church and his history and his story. Providential. Today, you'll go to lunch or you'll go somewhere else, and God will bring someone across your life. Providential moments that God, and we need to step expecting God to work. Could you imagine having a conversation with someone who needs Jesus, and you went in that conversation expecting God to save? God, I'm not being fearful. I'm going to expect you to do something today. I'm going to expect him to trust Jesus. I'm going to expect you to move this week. I'm going to expect you to move because I am stepping in faith. And fourth, we need to step in victory, not defeat. We step in victory, not defeat. I love these last two verses. Here we have Mordecai returned to the king's gate after being praised and honored, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Earlier, Mordecai and the Jews were in sackcloth and grieving. Now, Haman is mourning and grieving. The reversal has happened with the king's sleepless night. And Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, hey, listen, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. In other words, you should have told us that information before. Why'd you leave out that he was a Jew? Because if he's a Jew, don't you know about their God? Don't you know what their God has done? Don't you know the power of their God? Don't you know the miracles of their God? Don't you have the evidence of all that God has done for those people? You should not go up against that God because he protects his people. What a God they have. You cannot fall before them. This truth reminds us that God's people, fight from a place of victory. We fight from victory, not for victory. Even as we think about our own life in the face of death, in the face of fear. Jesus says in Matthew 10, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. See, we don't need to fear men, but fear God. We don't need to fear anything of this world, but fear God. Knowing and having Christ sets us free from the fear of death and compels us towards evangelistic zeal. It compels us toward faithfulness in this life. It compels us forward. Why do you think missionaries go to the field only to live their life to die? Because the people are in need of Jesus, and death is but a shadow. There's an eternity to come. Why do you think pastors have been burned at the stake and beheaded throughout history? Because people need Jesus, and death is but a shadow. And we got to take it to them. Christians have been persecuted and murdered for their faith. Why? Because people need Jesus, and death is but a shadow. And this is our calling, to step in faith, to step on providence, to trust God and not be distracted by the fear of man. Now, I'm convinced that many who claim to be Christians are more fearful of men than faithful to God. Many of us are more fearful of men than we are faithful to God. It's incredibly difficult to be faithful to God as long as you are fearful of men. It's incredibly difficult to step in faith as long as we are living in the fear of man. John Bloom, he writes for Desiring God, he wrote this: the fear of man can immobilize us when we should take action, and it can gag us into silence when we should speak. It feels powerful, but its power is deceptive. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. You see, God has the power to set us free of the fear of man. What's behind this fear? I mean, Esther shows us what's behind it. She came to a point where she had to decide who she was and who she belonged to and who she trusted. Who would she fear more, Xerxes or God? She chose God. See, we obey the one we fear. Do you get that? We obey the one we fear. If we fear men, then we let them tell us not to share the gospel. If we fear men, then we let them keep us trapped in our words. If we fear men, then we let them keep us trapped in our sin. Herschel York, writing on this topic, says, you must come to a place where you fear spiritual failure more than physical death. I fear failing spiritually more than physical death. I want to be faithful to the end in the face of death. And that's more important, obedience to God, than physical death. Here's what I think the problem is. The reason we are so hesitant to step out on faith is because we're not living out our identity and who we are in Christ, but in the idolatry of the world. We don't live in our identity of who Christ has called us to be and told us we are, but in the idolatry of the world. In other words, we don't live like Esther. We live a lot more like Haman. Haman lived for himself. Does this describe you? You want the robe. You want the crown and the kingdom. You want the followers. You want the friends who tell you what you want to hear. The last thing you want is to have to take your heart and your life and submit it to somebody else. Because deep down, you love yourself. Deep down, you have one person on your throne, and it is you. You live like Haman, not like Esther. Oh, listen, Jesus died to give you life. Christ is your victory. Idolatry is your enemy. Christ is your identity. Idolatry is your enemy. Faith is your calling. Victory is your assurance. We should not let the fear of man hold us back from trusting God by faith, by stepping into providence, stepping on providence as he called us to do. I want to call us to trust God today. Give us a call to trust God. And here it is. All the power we need to trust God is found in Christ's always abounding and never failing love for his people, and in God's precious providence in our life. When we believe God is in control of all of our life, it frees us to live intentionally. It frees us to live by faith, to step by faith. God, you're in control, and I'm trusting you by faith. R.C. Sproul says this: the providence of God is our fortress, our shield, and our very reward. It is what provides courage and perseverance for his saints. You think if God were to have told Esther exactly what she would have experienced before she did it, you think she would have done it? I don't know. See, God calls us to trust him and him alone. Some of us don't trust God. Some of us aren't trusting him with our life. Some of us are saying, I would trust Jesus if he would just show me his nail-scarred hands. I would trust Jesus if I saw the empty tomb. I would trust God if he would just show up and make it clear. But that's not how God works. God wants you to trust him by faith. Step out in faith and trust him. Do what he's called us to do. But some of you aren't walking by faith because you don't trust God at all. You don't trust him with your Bible reading. You don't trust the Bible. You don't trust him with your life. You don't trust him with your finances. You don't trust him with your marriage. You don't trust him with your heart. You don't trust God. But some of us trust God enough to maybe pray a prayer one day that secured our spot in heaven, and we sit around thinking that we're good to go because we prayed a prayer back then just to give us a peace of mind. So you have some faith. That's a good thing. But we need that faith to grow. We need to have faith that believes God. We need to have faith that says, oh God, I trust you with everything I have. We need to have an all-in sort of faith. What would it be like if you had an all-in faith that didn't live in fear of man, but that you went, Lord, I am stepping in Providence. I'm stepping in Providence. I am all in. I trust you with what your word says about prayer. All right, I'm going to pray. I trust you with what your word says about church. All right, I'm gonna come back to church now. What if you said, all right, Lord, I trust you with what your word says about eternity and about lives that are on the line today, friends and family, and I'm going to trust you expectantly to work, and I'm going to trust you with what your word says about death, and I'm going to trust you with what your word says about reading your word and memorizing it and meditating on it and putting it in my heart. I'm going to trust you with what your word says about parenting or about marriage, and I'm going to forgive them, and I'm not going to be bitter anymore, and I'm going to take them back in. I'm going to hold them and love them no matter what. I'm going to trust you with what your word says about evangelism or about whatever. Fill in the blank. Lord, I'm going to trust you because your word tells me you are a good God, that you love me. You'll never forsake me, that you'll never leave me, and I can trust you. Oh God, I am stepping in faith today. What kind of change do you think that would make in your life personally? What kind of change would that make in your heart and your attitude and your love? Some of us have crazy circumstances and you're like, but you don't understand my circumstance. It's crazy. Listen, when circumstances are out of control, God is in control. So you can step forward in courage and conviction, not scarediness. You can step forward from a place of security, not a place of threat. We can live from a place of faith, not of fear. While we aim to trust God in all things, we can never fully trust him with everything, as much as we want to. But there is one who did trust him with everything, the man Jesus Christ, our Savior, who perfectly stepped out in faith. Never was there a greater act of faith in the face of death than at Calvary, where Jesus stepped out, living a life among the very people who would murder him and kill him, and still going, God, you've called me to this. They hate me. They're against me. They're going to kill me. But I'm going. I'm stepping because my Father's called me. And even to the point of death, when his own Father turned his face away, Jesus says, they're worth it. I'm going to the cross because this is what God has called me to do. And he steps in obedience. He's the great one. He's the one we're to live for. Even as we think about this story like Esther, like Esther who stood before the king to intercede for her people, so did Jesus who stood to intercede for his people. But what was held out to him wasn't a golden scepter, but a wooden cross that he wouldn't just touch, that he would put his own body in. While Esther would set the people free by her faith, Jesus too would set the people free by his death, dying in our place for our sin. When you think about Esther who appeared on the third day to set her people free, she arose from her fast to stand before the king, and on the third day, Jesus arose from the tomb to set the people free. Jesus gives life like Esther gives life. Though Esther was only allowed to appear before the king one time, Jesus makes it so we can appear before the king for all eternity. And like Esther, who prepares a feast for the king, so is Jesus on that last day when he returns, is preparing a feast for all of his people. Jesus is the one in whom we are to worship and honor and follow and obey and step with, because God has not left us alone, but he has put his Spirit in us to cause us to be born to new life and a new identity, to a new way of walking by faith. What we're called to do, to walk by faith. And think about the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I love the movie. It's a great movie. He's tracking down the long traced Holy Grail, and he finally finds it, and he's got 3 tasks to overcome to get it. He overcomes the 2 obstacles, and he comes to the 3rd obstacle where he makes his way through a little opening where you just barely stand, and across from him is another rock wall and another small opening, and he looks down into this huge, deep, dark abyss. He reads his Holy Grail book, and he says to jump. And he goes, impossible. Nobody could jump this. And he goes back down, and it says he's got to take a step of faith. And he's sitting there at a moment. If I want what I want, I got to step out in faith. And he sits there, he holds back, he takes a deep breath, crosses his arms, and he steps out only to find a place for his foot to land. There, looking invisible, was a bridge the whole time that the first Crusaders had constructed that looks just like the other rock. And so when he looks to the side, he could see the shift, that while thought he was stepping into invisibility, he was actually stepping on a solid foundation. And that is so true for us. In the same way, we may not be able to see God's providential hands in front of us. The unknowns of our future may appear to be a deep, dark abyss. Like Esther, we may not know what awaits us or exactly how things will turn out. However, if we step out on faith with wisdom and humility and expectancy and in victory, God will be there to give us a firm foundation.